Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to talk pretty fast because I've got maybe slightly too much material, but hello kind of from the world of the arts, much more than, I'm not trying to help anybody, so I'm just, if you're expecting me to try and help you, that's not going to be me, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But what I want to talk about is very related, I think, to the past talks, which is the question of how to make game design itself kind of a focal point in academic circles, but also much more broadly than that. And so that's where I'm kind of going to go with this talk in a couple of different ways. So my context is that I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Design and Computation Arts at Concordia University. So I'm like a proper professor and everything. I've got that job. And I'm the associate director of the Technoculture Art and Games Lab in the Milieu Institute of Arts, Culture and Technology, which is a sort of research center at my university where we largely focus on researching games in different kinds of ways. But particularly we focus on making games as a form of research. So that's where my concern lies chiefly. And I've got this long history, so I do own a PhD. I bought it for cheap down at a store in a back street somewhere. And in that PhD, I was very interested in how video games communicate ideas through their designs, but from a very theoretical perspective, drew a lot of triangles and did semiotics and things like that. I wrote this book about games, and that was kind of about how the design of games is expressive and interesting, and why people should be interested in what games can do for your parents, especially your parents specifically. And then I started making games out of necessity because I was teaching game design at a university by then. They asked me to teach game design, and I'd never made a game, so I started immediately the next day. And so obviously then as a game designer, I was extremely concerned with this question of how design takes place. And now I'm an academic, right? I look like this. I'm sort of a clown at the university. And my research is making games. So the games themselves are the form of research. And so I kind of have to justify my existence constantly. And so that's what I'm going to kind of do, is I'm going to stand here and I'm going to justify my existence to all of you. And the big question that basically comes up in the lab that I work in, and I think sort of broadly in scholarship about video games, is this question of what design itself looks like, right? So players and the public and all of us, the most common way that we encounter a game is that it's this kind of finished thing, right, that you play. So it's kind of monolithic. You can't really change it most of the time. It just exists. And that's actually true for scholars a lot of the time as well, right? A lot of the time is spent analyzing games, for example. So the game is this finished thing, and you try and think about how that game is constructed. Maybe you try and imagine what the design was like, but you can't really speak to exactly what the design process was. Or as we've seen, a lot of the time games are used as kind of instruments for research, right? So that you build something and you test it, you see whether it works, for example, whether it has the effects that you expected. But again, you're not really in that instance focused on how the thing itself came to be or expressing how it came to be. And then as a designer, I think we often experience design as this very kind of ephemeral, intuitive thing, right? We do it, but we don't necessarily keep track of how it happened in much detail. It just sort of things emerge, and that's good because it's a creative process, right? But if you're in a university and you have a job at a university, like I do, you're suddenly very, very accountable for what you're doing, right? And so I can't just make cool games and then hand them into the tenure committee or whatever that is deciding my fate year to year. I need to be able to think about design itself as a form of research. And so that's what I've been preoccupied with for the last couple of years, really, and in some forms for much longer than that. So design is kind of invisible. It's a quality of a game or a product, of any kind of product, but it's kind of hard to grasp what it is. And if we're going to do research about it, we need to make it visible. So that's kind of where I want to go. And this is a really good time. We heard a reference actually to arts-based research at the beginning introductions. This is a really good time in the trajectory of design more generally to talk about process specifically. So there are all of these movements like research creation, which is a big thing in Canada. I don't know, it's not rocking the rest of the world yet, but it's huge in Canada. Research through design, practice-based research, arts-based research. These are all kinds of strategies for thinking about design as a form of research, the artifact as expressing research on its own, without necessarily focusing on kind of scholarly writing, for example. And we have students, of course, at the lab that I work at, and they are pursuing this idea of research creation, which means that their thesis is, at least in part, for example, making a game itself and presenting that as a research artifact at the end of their work. The problem with that, and the problem especially for students and for me as well, is that you kind of fall into the situation where you make an interesting game, but then the research is kind of like the game, and you just hand it to people and say, this is my game. It's research, and people either believe you or they don't. Or you end up sort of handing people a game and some kind of explanatory essay, right? So here's the game, and here's the explanation of why it's research. And those can be really great approaches, but they're also kind of dissatisfying. They don't kind of get at the aliveness of design and how things come to be. We're kind of stuck thinking about the end point of design, right, rather than design itself. And there are a bunch of stakeholders here. I've mentioned students a few times. Like it's a big concern for those of us supervising graduate students who want to create games as part of their research, or even undergraduate students. We can't really let them just make a game and hand it in as a thesis. So we kind of need some way that they can sort of justify and talk about their process and why the thing they made is the way that it is. And one thing that I will just say as somebody who I guess I'm a game designer, definitely by now I've made a lot of games. I think this idea of thinking deeply about process and about what you're doing moment to moment in design really enriches your practice a lot. I found it incredibly valuable, and I'll talk about some examples of that. And I think it's just possible as well. And I think we see this with performative design, right? That, for example, Flambeer, having Twitch streaming of their development process, that players are also interested in how these things come to be, right? So I think there are all kinds of people who are interested in the design process being available in some way. So I want to talk about two perspectives on this. One of which is sort of about making game design visible in the finished artifact. So having games that kind of expose their own design, which is a strange concept, but I think it makes some sense and it can be pretty interesting. And the other one is a little bit more stuffy sounding, I think, materializing game design through process documentation. It's a bit dry. But I think as a designer and as an academic, that's actually what I'm most excited about in some ways, is making design visible moment to moment. And so I'll talk about both of these approaches over the next minutes. So the first thing is this idea of materializing game design through game design. So we all accept that games are expressive, right? Like this is really important, I'm sure, to all of us in this room, that games can express ideas or feelings or situations, historical periods, etc. And one of the things, therefore, that games could express is design itself. So design, like anything else, is an idea, it's a process. A game could be about design in some sense, and that could be a way to talk about how games work. And I think that that's a really interesting thing, and I find this particularly interesting as a designer, because to think about your own process, I think takes you deeper into what you think games are and what they can do, and then you can kind of share that with other people in an interesting way. And so there's three main ways that I've kind of been pursuing this over the years, related to different aspects, different kind of levels, I suppose, of the technologies of making games that I wanted to just quickly profile here to give you an example of I guess, what I mean about this. So the first one that I'm really interested in is that we use all of these technologies to make games, whether that's VR, AR, or just plain old Unity on a screen or something along those lines. And I'm really interested in players being kind of aware of the technologies that make their games exist, right? Because there's a drive towards transparency, right? You're not supposed to think about what a game is made of. You're supposed to just be immersed in the wonders of the world that it creates, for example. And I think a really good example of this is water. So water is a huge part of the aesthetics of lots of games, right? Water is really, really important. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that water is often used as a kind of benchmark of technical achievement, in especially 3D games, right? People actually talk about how good the water is, like in a review or something. They give it a score, like 8 out of 10 for the water. And so, it's this really, really important thing. But games aren't about water, generally speaking. There might be a specialist game about water. But generally speaking, the water is the thing that you wade through to shoot somebody in the face on the other side of the water, right? So you're trying to get through the water. Maybe it makes a sound and reflects the sunlight nicely, but it's not really about the water. And so you don't necessarily think deeply about water technologies when you play a game. And so I was interested in making a game where you did. And so I made this game called VR3, which is a museum of water. So you can see the museum here. And rather than water, I'll just pause this at opportune moments. Rather than the game having sort of water incidentally, I'll just pause there, Robert's water. It's got these sort of instances of technical implementations of water in these plinths, right? So you can actually, specifically, the game is saying, look at this water, like think about this water, think about how this water is a technical artifact. Think about how Robert Yang, who made this game that you also know, lent Pippin this water so that he could put it in this game. And so the artificiality of the water is very, very much foregrounded, right? Which is interesting in tension with the idea that, water is this natural substance, right? But in games, of course, it isn't. I think a lot of the power of the game comes from the kind of comparative effect. You can see that there are a lot of plinths in this gallery. So you can look at a lot of different kinds of water, and that obviously encourages you to think about what are the differences between kinds of water that you see in video games. So you can walk over here and you can see water that I was lent. I don't know if you can lend water, I guess he just gave it to me. Mole Industria, Paolo Petticini, gave me this water, which is a low polygon water, right? So it's a completely different kind of water to Robert's water. It's low poly, it's got a very, very different aesthetic. The very fact, again, that it was loaned to me is interesting. Here's a kind of mango water. You might think this water kind of sucks compared to Robert's water and Paolo's water. But you start to develop kind of taste opinions about water. As you move through the gallery, you see that different waters cost different amounts of money as well, because I had to buy these from the Unity Asset Store. So there's $5 water, $20 water, free water. So that builds up this whole kind of understanding of the technical thing of water in games. And that surfaces for you as a player, these games are made of technologies, and you actually start to think about it, right? So another approach to kind of making design and technology visible is the idea of variation. Sorry about all of the emojis, by the way. I just got totally obsessed with making a presentation based on emojis for some reason. I'm not sure why. So another level of game design is the idea of mechanics, right? And materializing mechanics, I think, is really interesting because it helps us to get away from the kind of monolithic nature of games, that they just are the way they are. And so this is a pretty familiar game, Pong, 2 paddles and a ball, bouncing back and forth, very, very simple, kind of the game in some ways. But that does seem kind of monolithic and unchangeable, right? That's what Pong is, end of story. But of course, software is completely malleable, right? Things don't have to be the way they are. They could be any other way that you can imagine. And so I had this project a number of years ago now, because I'm old and dying, which was all about this idea of Pong and changing Pong to show you that it's not fixed. So one change that you can make is that you can make the pedals slightly transparent, and you can just disable collision on the pedals, right? So you get ghost Pong, where the 2 pedals are dead and they can no longer play the game. So it's got this it's completely broken, right? The game sucks. You can't really play it. You can just move the pedals and watch the score go up. The game never ends because you have to win by 2 points. And yet it has this kind of pathos to it now, right? It's added a kind of emotional framing of the experience where it kind of feels like something in a way that Pong doesn't. It's no longer competitive. It's kind of sad and wistful. So it's different, and yet it was a very, very small change. This is another small change, right? This is like 2 lines of code. Now one pedal is bigger than the other pedal. And again, like, it's simple. It's still Pong now, right? You can still compete. But it's completely changed the affect of what it's like to experience the game. For one thing, I think it's a huge victory if the little pedal even manages to hit the ball now, right? So there's this kind of elation in performing an action that was normally is just like the normal thing that you do. Maybe you sort of grow to hate the big pedal, or maybe you sort of always want to be the big pedal. You have this kind of David and Goliath narrative that's going on now. So it has these different properties to Pong, again, with just a very, very simple change. And it actually brings into focus a really important game design principle, right, for multiplayer games, which is that idea of sort of balance and equivalence between players, that it should always be fair to make sure that the game is, I don't know, just like it's like a game, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. The last example is more of an aesthetic one, right? So a simple change that you can make to Pong is to just have the ball leave a trail, right? It doesn't affect the actual bouncing around or play of the game. But by making it about the aesthetics, I think it's very likely that when you play this game, you want to play collaboratively, right? Because the line vanishes when the ball goes off the screen and it resets the drawing. And so it becomes a kind of collaborative art thing that you do with the person you're playing with, so that maybe you want to help them get the shot rather than sort of trying to bounce it in trick shots off the corners and so on. So again, there's this idea that we saw in the museum as well of sort of accumulating examples to kind of make not an argument, but like to really allow people to draw comparisons and really think deeply about the materials of games. There's like another 33 versions of Pong in this game, and I've done this idea more than once with different games because I find it very generative. So that idea that, that mechanics aren't fixed and that mechanics are a designed element that somebody is thinking of, right? The final example I want to talk about is sort of the expressive nature of games, kind of the idea of games as a language. And so one thing that I've become interested in is the idea of translating one game into another game as a way of kind of thinking about, what are the essential parts of a game and how do we express it in another language. And so this is a game I made last year called Sibilant Snakelikes. And as you can see, I've kind of decided to try and redesign fairly famous games like Shadow of the Colossus, Minesweeper, Miss Pac-Man, etc., recognizable games, into the language of the classic cell phone game Snake, where there's the snake and it moves around on the screen, it eats apples, gets longer, and you try not to collide with your own body. So that's a very limited kind of palette of possible mechanics that Snake has. So then how do you make Shadow of the Colossus if that's the language that you're trying to communicate in? And it's, again, a great process to follow as a designer, right? Because it's this challenge and you have to think deeply about what you're doing. But again, I think it surfaces these questions of design for a player. So if we look at Shadow of the Colossus, for example, you can see that it's trying to recreate aspects of Shadow of the Colossus. It can't do everything, it's imperfect. But you can have this idea of scale, right? So the Colossus is much, much bigger than you. This is based on the first Colossus in the game with the sword. The idea of climbing has now been replaced with kind of eating apples that are part of the Colossus's body. So climbing is this really, central part of Shadow of the Colossus. So you need to find some way of re-representing that with a snake. And then there's this idea in Shadow, of course, of the death blow where you destroy the Colossus by driving your sword into its head. And in this instance, it's when you eat the last apple, right? And the Colossus dissolves into this black smoke, which goes into your body, right? So it's trying to use the semiotics and the sort of meanings and important parts of the original game, but trying to use this very limited language to express them again. And as you can see, you get 0 points to try and get at that sort of idea of the weird ethical conundrum that you end up in Shadow of the Colossus, where you're not sure if what you're doing is the right thing to do, right? So it's not valued by the game. If you know both of these games, and I tried to pick games that would be in that kind of situation, then you can kind of reconstruct how I must have gone about the design process, right? You can see the decisions that I was making like in the game itself because you know that it's an act of translation. And therefore you might also have opinions about whether I kind of fucked things up. For example, like you might think, oh, I would have done it this way, or this is a bad idea, this doesn't translate that game. And so in doing that, you're basically doing game design yourself, right? While you're watching the game and while you're playing the game. And so in that sense, I think that this kind of process keeps design alive while you're kind of experiencing it, right? Normally design is finished once you have the final artifact, but here I feel like it still feels like it's a little bit open, and therefore it's kind of surfacing these ideas. This is Papers, Please. I won't talk about this one. You can always go and play these. They're all free on my website. And again, like, there's more than one, so that we have this accumulation of examples so that you can kind of get a sense for the process that's going on here, the decisions that need to be made. You can start to see, well, you can do shadow with a snake, right? But how do you do some other completely different mechanic like immigration control? And this is how I did it, but again, you might do it some other way, right? So with an accumulation, you can start to think of snake as a kind of language of expression, right? And then you're thinking about game design specifically. And I think even the sort of failures of translation here, where it doesn't feel like it works, even that's interesting, right? Because that's, again, it's still thinking about design. Design is hugely about failure and not really getting things right when you try and do them. So I just wanted to tie this back to kind of the scholarly world, because it's easy for me to kind of get excited about just design and making cool stuff. As a person who's now kind of an academic, I am an academic, got to get used to saying that and owning it. It's really, really helpful for me at a research level to be thinking so explicitly about aspects of game design in the games that I make, right? To make games about game design to some extent, right? Working with the materials in that way, whether it's translation or thinking about variations on mechanics, it forces you to think deeply about how game design actually works, because those are our materials, right? The technologies like Unity, the game sort of constraints like Snake, etc. And so at times it almost feels like a kind of chemistry or something. It almost feels scientific, even though it's of course not entirely. And so this gets at this idea of research through design, I think, or research creation, as we call it in Canada, that the creation of something, a creative artifact like a game, is research into that thing itself. And the other great thing, and something that we necessarily have to care about as academics and game designers, frankly, is how do you get these ideas into the world, right? And so as academics, the tradition is that we would write a paper, and we would present it at a conference, or we would send it to a journal, and that's a time-honored and effective way of communicating knowledge. But it's clear, I think, as well, that these games can communicate ideas about game design. They can serve this purpose to some extent as well, and they're sort of much easier to get into people's heads, right? Because it's kind of a Trojan horse effect. Like, I tell you it's a game, and then you play it, and maybe you're hugely disappointed. You're like, this is a stupid building full of water. Why did you tell me that was a game? But you can still trick people into kind of taking a look, at the very least, with this word game and this idea of play. And so you get it in front of more faces, and therefore, maybe more people have a chance to think about these ideas. So something like Sibilant Snakelikes, which I consider to be like a semi-failure in terms of how many people actually experienced it, it was still played by over 5,000 people, right? And like in an academic context, if 5,000 people had read my PhD thesis, for example, which they didn't, that would be incredible, right? That would be insane reach if 5,000 people encountered my ideas. But with games, that's very, very possible. And another translation project that's very much in a similar vein, using Snake again, called Snakeisms, which was about translating philosophical concepts into Snake again. That was played 140,000 times, right? And that's like, whoa, that's like insane reach in terms of putting ideas in front of people. So I think it's really exciting that way. So it's one thing to talk about this kind of idea of the end point of design as being interesting and being able to communicate about design process. But it remains the fact that it's more interesting to think about the actual process itself. I think it's really, really vital especially again as academics and scholars who are trying to talk about design, that we're able to surface the process in different ways. And so you can do that with games, but really you can also do that by actually surfacing the real process that you go through. So the idea here is that I think it's important that we don't just always have the final artifact, but that we have the stuff along the way, right? And that we treat that as important research material. I should say as well that when I'm talking about design here, I really mean the entire process of creating a game. I don't think that you can really separate ideas of design from, for example, grappling with the technologies that you actually use to implement something. Design is always taking place throughout the process of making something all the way until it gets into people's hands, right? And perhaps beyond, depending on the kind of game that you make. This is in line with a scholar called Donald Schoen, who wrote this book called The Reflective Practitioner. And he talks about design as a conversation with materials, which I really like, right? So design takes place as you grapple with the things that you work with. And so I very much subscribe to that as an understanding of how design takes place. So really, like, if design is a conversation with materials, we need to be able to hear that conversation later on as scholars and people who are actually engaged with thinking about how design takes place. And so that's the next thing that I kind of want to talk about to sort of wrap this up, is a project that I'm working on with my colleagues at Concordia University, Rila Khalid, who's also my wife, and Jonathan Dessart. We all work at the TAG Lab as well. And we're trying to come up with a methodology for process documentation that will allow us to kind of capture the design process as it happens, rather than, for example, trying to reconstruct it from memory or write an essay about it at the end when we can't even remember why we made the decisions that we made, and we perhaps generate some kind of false narrative on top of things. So we want to capture kind of the liveness of design. We're calling it the method right now, simply because we don't have a name. It's sort of grandiose. I kind of like it in some ways. It's very Marina Abramovich, actually, which is kind of good. Feels powerful, but it's also so generic that nobody will know what we're talking about, so that's not good. And it's about this idea of conversation with materials and making a conversation actually kind of audible, I guess, to people who aren't the designer, who aren't inside the designer's head or the developer's head. So we want to lean into that idea that design is taking place when you actually make something. And really the biggest sort of component of this, and the thing that is driving us along, is the idea of using version control to track design as well as technical development. So generally speaking, version control is used so that you can maintain snapshots of your code base as you go through a project, so that you can roll back and fix bugs and kind of keep track of what's going on in large teams, etc. And the move that we're wanting to make is to use that same exact framework and technology as a way of tracking how design is taking place as well. So we focus on documentation through version control. We use Git and SourceTree and GitHub, but the technologies themselves don't matter. It's more the idea. So a game ends up being kind of represented like this. This is a repository of my game. It is as if you were doing work, which was a sort of speculative future in which people do work for fun, basically, or fake work for fun, I should say. And so the base level of what you're talking about here is that you have a repository. So you can see it's got the code in it, right? There's JavaScript and images and all of the sort of codey things that are required to make a game work. But it also has process documentation. Most obviously, there's a folder there called process, but that's kind of the least of it in some ways. So I wanted to kind of talk about how this works in the last 10 minutes or less, if I can speak fast. The biggest thing that you get out of version control in the sense of recovering design is that you can go back to any committed build, any build that you've made along the way, and you can actually just reload it and play it, right? So that's an amazing thing if you're thinking about scholarship of design, is to be able to actually experience the steps that went from the very, very beginning all the way to the finished product, right? You can you can see how a game comes into being. And importantly, it's interactive, right? We talk about constantly how important interactivity is. We don't necessarily know what it is, but it's very important. If we're going to talk about thinking about the design process and how a game comes into being, it's really important to see how that interactivity the actual experience of a game developed as well. And so by being able to sort of pull down different builds along the history of a game, you can actually experience what a game was like the whole way through. And again, this may sound, especially to game developers, like, why would you want to play early builds of something that sounds like the worst thing ever because it's not finished yet? Like, as scholars who want to think about how these things come into being, it's absolutely fascinating and kind of vital. So you can use a tool like Source Tree, for example, and you can kind of basically travel in time backwards through a project, right? And you can see it, for example, for this game, it is as if you were doing work. This is the very first thing that I committed. It looks like shit, obviously. It's just like me trying to get jQuery even working on my computer. But you can already see that it's going to be a game about user interface elements. It's going to have like some radio buttons and checkboxes and stuff. And then over time, you can like load another build a little bit further down. You can see that it's building into this idea now of like having multiple user interface elements on the screen at the same time, different kinds of modalities that you might use. You can see I made a shift at a certain point to a slightly more refined aesthetic, but that I also kind of removed human language from the game. So now it's got this kind of alien language that's a step along the way in the creation of this game. Eventually it developed into something that looks a bit more game-like, right? There's an instruction thing now, and there's like a task to actually perform, where you're kind of trying to interpret this language and do the right thing. And then there's this radical moment in the design, and again, this is like visible and playable, right? Where I shifted to a Windows 95 aesthetic, just suddenly. It's explained in the process documentation, but like it's a radical break, right? From that to that is a big moment in the design that is visible because of this methodology. And then you can get all the way to the final release, right? Where it turns out that what I really wanted to make was a kind of Windows 95 busy work kind of simulator with inspirational phrases and all kinds of aspects like that. If you can't see this trajectory and these builds especially, you wouldn't know that like this was ever part of the thought process, right, for the thing that you see at the end. So it really, really allows you to look at what happens in game design itself. And you can see how if you're a scholar and you want to build a kind of argument about this game, having access to all of those things lets you tell a really interesting story about how a designer goes about changing their ideas over time. There are other obvious elements. I might skip through some of this because I think it's pretty blatant, right? Like a process journal is a really important aspect of any kind of method where you're trying to actively track design process. So I've written process journals throughout my kind of time making games, but I've started taking it more and more seriously. This is about an erotic user interface game I'm working on now. Come see me if you want to talk about it and help me work out how the hell to make it. So the process journal gives a kind of linear, reflective account of game design decisions as they kind of get made on a day-to-day basis. Again, each one is tied to a specific build, so you could read a diary entry and then also play the build that the designer was kind of contemplating when they wrote that, right? That's actually anchored to the game itself. But really the most important thing about version control is this idea of the commit. So a commit is when you actually store a step of your development into the version control repository, right? So it's the thing that creates this kind of chronology of information step by step as a game comes into being. And so normally the process with a commit is that you work out, you do a bunch of work, kind of some sort of unit of work, and then you commit it and you write a little description, right? And traditionally, the idea as developers is that you write a concise description of the technical implementation details, right? And you can see that that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, just the things that I did along the way to make the game actually come into being. And of course, if you're a student or you're a normal, real person, what you really write is just like blah, 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 or X, or test, or something, because nobody likes writing commit messages. Like, generally speaking, they're a huge pain, and so people sort of avoid it. And my general response to commit messages, at least initially as we started trialing this method, was to keep it on the technical level, right? Because the process journal is the thing that keeps track of design. I was thinking of design as very separated at that time from the technical implementation. But we realized after doing the it is as if you were doing work repository, which is where these commit messages come from, we realized that that moment of commitment, of technical commitment, where you say, this is a block of work that I'm committing to the repository, is also a moment of design commitment, right? If we're talking about a conversation with materials, then when you commit something into your repository, it means you've done work, and if you've done work, it means you've done design at some level, right? And that turns out, we think, to be a really important moment to reflect on what you've been doing. And so my commit messages now look like this. Terrifying, again, if you're a developer, to think of writing that much when you are doing work. But the idea is to use the kind of technical process that already exists with version control of committing as you go along, and using that as an explicit trigger to reflect on what am I doing right now that is a kind of a design, an intentional design decision, right? That is often taking place because of the technology itself. So here you can see I'm, I believe, thinking about the idea of ghost snakes in Miss Pac-Man. Yes, in Miss Pac-Man, the snake translation of Miss Pac-Man, right? So questions around the materiality of snakes and why can a ghost eat something if it's like a ghost, and why do the ghosts not go through walls? And there's all kinds of questions of kind of interesting metaphysics and design that go into the contrast, I guess, between snake physics on the one hand and Pac-Man physics on the other, right? And how do you reconcile them? That's design, right? And that comes up as you actually try to implement things, not when you write some kind of design document at the top of things. So just to kind of summarize why that's important, like I say, like this active documentation thing, just as a person who makes games and wants to think deeply about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, having these kinds of sort of technical structures around me to push me to actually think deeply about what I'm doing and why is super helpful, just in order to reflect and feel like I'm genuinely engaging with the research question that my game is kind of about a lot of the time. You know, there's always some kind of question, even if it's sort of weird, and sort of accountable that way. And in terms of dissemination and thinking about the broader scholarly community, you know, these repositories are public-facing, they're open source, and so technically if somebody were ever interested in, for example, writing about sibilant snake-likes or my new UI sex game, they would be able to go back and have this wealth of information where they could actually know what I was thinking of, and they would know why it is the way it is, right? And that's the thing that I think constantly kind of gets left behind when we talk about design, is that we focus on the final thing and all of its properties, but we don't think about why it exists and how it came to be the way it is. And we think that this method is at least a start on maybe thinking about that kind of problem, if it's a problem for you. So those are the two things that I kind of wanted to bring up, speaking about game design as a practitioner and an academic at the same time. So that idea that you can use game design itself to kind of talk about itself in an infinite spiral of navel-gazing, and process documentation as like a serious opportunity to really start expressing what design is and how it takes place, so that we can think about it, because frankly it's interesting. Thank you very much. That's me.